What's fascinating is Dela disappeared from history in 1920. Then all of his artworks showed up in an antique store. Somebody had come across this stuff. And in 1971, an author realized the significance of the whole thing. And he started to bring out the images of the airships that were being developed in the 1850s. Now, here's where it all dovetails with the JFK assassination. It's quite interesting. There's a character named John de Menil, and his wife's name was Dominique Schlumberger. She was a major artist and a major kind of humanitarian of the period and philanthropist. So she put the Dela art on display with all the arrows and all the rest of it. Well, in the Garrison investigation, he went into Schlumberger, or Schlumberger is the actual name in France is. They were the biggest oil company, operating 75% of the oil equipment in the world. And he found out over and over again that they were related to characters like George de Mohrenschildt, the oil geologist who shuttled Lee Harvey Oswald around. And it seemed kind of unusual. You know, here's Oswald making $1.25 an hour, and de Mohrenschildt is a millionaire. What does he want to do with this guy? Well, it's quite interesting because de Mohrenschildt is an oil geologist and later turns up writing letters to George Bush, who's the head of the CIA of the period, saying, you know, this Kennedy assassination thing happened. I talked out of turn about Oswald. Not all these people are after me. I wonder if you can get me off the hook. And he sends a series of letters to George Bush that are on the record from the 70s. This is like 10 years after the Kennedy assassination. So de Mohrenschildt gets a subpoena, and they say, we're the House Assassination Committee. We think you have information about Oswald being connected to the CIA. He gets the subpoena, goes into his room, supposedly, and blows his brains out. Now, there's a lot of weird things about de Mohrenschildt, including the fact that he was obviously assassinated himself because they had finally figured him out. But here's the strange part. The Dela images came through Jean de Menil and his wife, who were these incredible art connoisseurs. Those are the same people who had set up and were connected with de Mohrenschildt. So the Schlumberger Oil Company and de Mohrenschildt in Houston were, you know, operated on a very elite level, and they worked with people like the Bushes, etc. This is why he wrote letters to Bush as CIA director later. So you're looking at a dramatic crisscross, but in the middle of it, it can't be denied that de Menil is the same person who put Dela back on the map. Here's the Aero group again, back from the 1850s, NIMSA and the whole thing. And here's the thing. This is an Aero painting by Dela, and it has two very interesting elements that are predictive. Remember earlier we looked at the Elon element that was predictive about von Braun's work. Well, when you look at this, what stands out for you is the name on the top. It says Trump.
Hard not to see.
On the bottom, on the right, it says 45, which is the art series. And Trump was the 45th president of the United States. Trump, 45, Aero airship, all in one snap. That's Dela's painting. Dela has a series of works. He has over 500 paintings documenting the Sonora Aero Club. Apparently, Trump was on his radar 100 years earlier. Figure that one out.
I'm trying to.
So you can see we've come to a pretty deep place in the middle of all this. That's what happens when we get into the aerospace Aero aspect of this. It shows up, the crisscross, politically, geopolitically, over and over again. Advanced technology, aerospace, and the political side. That is dark journalism. When Lee Harvey Oswald signs up for a job at the Texas School Book Depository, he's walking in and signing up for a job, and the owner of the building is someone who heads up an experimental aerospace company. named LTV, Ling Temco Vout. But this character, D.H. Byrd, who owned the Texas School Book Depository, where the shots were fired from, allegedly, in the Warren Commission, his name was David H. Byrd, but they called him Dryhole Byrd because he was an oil man. And he was the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who'd done the famous Antarctica expeditions. He was also the cousin of Harry Byrd, who was the senator who headed up all the NASA funding. So we're in an interesting place, I think, with this guy, right off the bat, that there's an Antarctica connection as soon as they make that turn onto Elm Street from the limousine where the shots are fired. They're going right past a building that D.H. Byrd, whose cousin discovered Antarctica, those shots are coming from there. So D.H. Byrd, it turns out, funded all the expeditions to Antarctica. He's the main funder. As a matter of fact, there's something called D.H. Byrd Mountain in Antarctica. Well, that's the owner of the Texas School Book Depository. So when we get into it now, we're looking at an unusual figure who is connected deeply with Lyndon Baines Johnson. So that is the person who will assume the presidency when President Kennedy is assassinated. So you can see we're in deep waters once you start looking at it past the Warren Commission and past the superficial media treatment. You're dealing with very deep players. And obviously Antarctica is where the kind of high technology aspect comes in. But Byrd with LTV was already, this is an experimental aerospace company. And you know, my basic thing around the JFK assassination is it's all aerospace. Everywhere you look, it is aerospace interests. Somehow aerospace and NASA, that piece is where the JFK, the root of the assassination, comes from. On November 12th, if you go back into the history of President Kennedy, you will see that he asked the Central Intelligence Agency for all the, quote, high threat cases related to the UFO file. And that he said he wanted to share them because they were doing a joint program with the Russians. So therefore, for me, the direct correlation between the secrecy that they've been developing in the background, I think President Kennedy thought the public can handle this and there's a way to open up the public to it. But his first kind of lethal mistake in all of this thinking was that the groups in the background, I mean, he really thought he was the president. I guess this is the problem. And the groups in the background who were so dedicated to the secrecy aspect operated in that intelligence corridor between intelligence and aerospace. And it's very interesting because the only person who brought a prosecution in the assassination of President Kennedy was Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison, who was the New Orleans DA who went deep into the case, his final conclusion was that it's actually an aerospace intelligence wing of the military-industrial complex that did it. Well, that got lost in the mix somewhere along the line. I did a documentary a few years ago called Agent Oswald, and it was all about his CIA role. And a guy got in touch with me who's a Watergate lawyer. His name is Douglas Caddy, and he represented the Watergate 7. He's a historical figure. He's in his 80s now. And he contacted me and he said, there's so many things in your documentary that were right on. He said, but I want to tell you this, that my friend was E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt was the top CIA asset in the country. And I asked him before he went to prison over Watergate for breaking in at Watergate, what happened, President Kennedy's assassination. And then he stopped and said President Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to give our most vital secret to the Russians. He was going to share it. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And Hunt said it was the UFO file. That's a conversation that took place in private in 1975. And for me, it's more of that opening.
And then we walked out, and on the street there, I thought, well, this is the last time I'll see Howard. I'm going to make one more stab, okay?
Yeah.
At seeing if I can get something here, And I said, well, Howard, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said, John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. About to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. And I was stunned by that. I mean, John Kennedy, our president, Soviets, and I never even heard about such a thing. And I said, well, what was that? And at that point, he leaned forward and looked right in my eyes, directly in my eyes, and he said, "The alien presence." And he reached out and shook my hand, and then turned and walked away. And that was the last time I saw Howard Hunt. Now, looking back, it didn't make any impression to me at the time. It didn't mean that much to me. I knew it was important, but it did not mean that much. There's no way I could, in the alien presence, I was not really familiar with that either, you know. But I remembered it. I knew it was important.
Roswell would become the first known UFO crash when residents reported seeing unusual lights in the sky, and a rancher named Mac Brazel told authorities about a large-scale debris field scattered on his ranch from a crashed craft of some kind. Intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel from the 509th Atomic Bomb Group was the first to see the wreckage. He described a mysterious metal that wouldn't bend or burn, along with strange markings that resembled Egyptian hieroglyphics.
It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of, because being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and our air travel. This is nothing like that. It could not have been.
The Army covered up the crash, explaining it away as a weather balloon. Dinosaur space warcraft. This project, officially the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur, was originally conceived in Nazi Germany. One of the paperclip scientists brought over to create an X-series of space planes was Walter Dornberger, who was a general in the SS and Wernher von Braun's superior in the Nazi rocket program. Dornberger was originally slated to face death at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity by using inhumane methods on his slave labor population building the V-2 rockets. After his release and move to America, Dornberger had landed the post of vice president of Bell Helicopter in 1952. Dornberger's understudy at Bell was a promising engineer named Michael Payne, the son of the inventor of the Bell helicopter, Arthur Young. Payne and his wife, Ruth, hosted Lee Harvey Oswald and his Russian wife, Marina, at their home in Irving, Texas. Most of the incriminating evidence against Oswald, including the controversial backyard photo supposedly showing Oswald holding a rifle and a pistol, along with communist literature, which photo experts have repeatedly shown were tampered with, seem to indicate the plan for making Oswald the patsy started very early. On November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination, Irving Police Captain Paul Barger reported that a telephone repairman had overheard a male voice, presumably Michael Payne, speaking from the Payne household in a telephone call, saying he did not feel Oswald was responsible, and he further stated, quote, "We both know who is responsible," unquote. Researchers later claimed the info had come from an FBI wiretap of Payne's phone, but he was never questioned about it. Dornberger was at the very core of the X technology program, and his greatest achievement, the X-15, still holds the record for a manned space plane set 60 years ago. The presence of Oswald at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne, with their deep connections to Dornberger, shows the tentacles of aerospace interests reaching into the major assassinations. Far from being the drifter and loser that the Warren Commission had portrayed him as, Oswald had actually been stationed at a high security position in Atsugi in Japan during the development of the secret U-2 plane. In the summer before the JFK assassination, Oswald, while working at the Riley Coffee Company, which was a CIA front, was telling his fellow employees that he was going to work for NASA, which was why he was moving to Texas. When New Orleans DA Jim Garrison inquired about Oswald's fellow employees at Riley, he learned the odd fact that most of his co-workers had gone on to jobs at NASA or other aerospace companies. During the height of Garrison's investigation into Clay Shaw and the JFK assassination, he got in touch with Warren Hinkle, the publisher of Ramparts magazine, telling him it was urgent that they speak immediately. Hinkle's account follows. "This is urgent," Jim Garrison said. "Can you take this in the mailroom?" They'd never think to tap the mailroom extension. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. "This is risky, but I have little choice. It is imperative that I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oil men do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way we first thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination. But as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. I've got the names of 3 companies and their employees who were involved in setting up the president's murder. Do you have a pencil? I wrote down the names of the 3 defense contractors. Garrison identified them as being Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics, and the names of those executives in their employ whom the district attorney said had been instrumental in the murder of Jack Kennedy. I said that I had everything down, and Garrison said a hurried goodbye. It's poor security procedure to use the phone, but the situation warrants the risk. I wanted you to have this in case something happens. The investigation trail led Garrison directly to the aerospace companies developing the X technology in the UFO file. His arrest of Clay Shaw was a shot across the bow. It would eventually be revealed that Shaw had been a CIA asset and had a murky trail of associates, including David Ferry, a CIA pilot who had worked closely with Guy Bannister. Ferry was also an expert hypnotist. Garrison discovered that Ferry had been Oswald's squad commander in the Civil Air Patrol when Oswald was only 15. The grooming of Oswald by Ferry and intelligence services had paid off when he was selected as the patsy for the JFK assassination. Garrison was planning to bring Ferry to trial for conspiracy. Instead, Ferry died mysteriously and left behind typed suicide notes. Garrison's case against Clay Shaw collapsed. The CIA had worked overtime behind the scenes to undermine it, according to Victor Marchetti, an assistant to CIA Director Richard Helms. The media would also be used to demonize Garrison's efforts at revealing the truth. When Garrison's Shaw trial was over in 1969, a mysterious document appeared, leaked by an unknown insider who called himself William Torbett. The document revealed a previously unknown government division called Defense Industrial Security Command, or DISC, which was described as a NASA security division, headed by former Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. The Torbett document identified the following individuals as DISC agents: Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. Bloomfield had headed up Permindex, a CIA front world trade company that specialized in assassinations and was based in Montreal. The earliest blueprint for a group linked directly to X-Protect had been revealed in the mysterious Torbett document. President Kennedy's desire to open the UFO file and share it with the Russian government for purposes of a joint moon mission, as demonstrated in National Security Action Memorandum 271 and his November 12th memo to the director of the CIA. Kennedy had struggled his entire presidency with the out-of-control intelligence community to reassert presidential power over their unconstitutional actions. He mused to aides in private that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. A major piece of this effort was reasserting control over the UFO file that had been lost at the end of the Eisenhower administration.
You've said on the record that Wernher von Braun actually predicted the rise of Elon Musk and SpaceX in the 21st century. When did this happen?
It's quite fascinating, and I want to put this out there that it's documented. It comes directly out of his book, Project Mars, so it's undeniable. The book was published in 1949, and it is a sci-fi novel, and it has all this technical information. And if you think about von Braun for a moment, we're taking him now from the Nazi rocket program where, they built the rockets, the V-2 rockets, to attack England and all that with slave labor. So he comes directly out of this SS setup. So we have to understand that about him before we bring him over through Project Paperclip and clean up his image and make him, the king of NASA, as it were. Now, when we get to von Braun, it's very interesting because through my work with Russell Targ, who's a physicist that developed the remote viewing program for the Central Intelligence Agency, he told me that when he met von Braun, he found out that von Braun's mother was psychic and that she would predict things and that she was well known as a psychic in the area, and people would come to her for predicting weather. They would come to her for predicting incidents, wars, whatever it happened to be. So von Braun instantly has an unusual footprint, as it were. And Targ said that von Braun came to him and said, I want you to develop an ESP testing device for NASA astronauts, because those we send into space need to have this high intuition on the psychic level. So that's what von Braun told Targ. And he did, in fact, develop the ESP testing device. Now, it's very interesting because when I went back and read Project Mars, and there's two of them, there's Project Mars and the Mars Project, two different books. But there's a prediction in there about who leads Mars in this expedition that happens. And when they get there, this expedition from Earth to Mars, when they get there, there's a whole civilization set up there. And the person who runs Mars is called Elon. So it's an undeniable, sort of strange and unusual prediction. But here's the other thing, which is that Elon himself is obsessed with going to Mars. So now we have an unusual kind of crisscross here about, and you're going to find this predictive quality when you get around the deep aerospace players. I'll have another example for you before we're done today. But there's something about going into that book. When I went into it further, I found many of the UFO cases that would come up, the same names, Colonel Halt, for example. There's a lot of similarities in that book. L. Ron Hubbard's name, one of the commanders is Ron Hubbard. So we're getting into unusual territory when we're dealing with von Braun. But his comment about Musk is undeniable. And I'm going to have you read the quote because I brought it with me. And the quote, I actually put it up on the screen. This is from von Braun's Project Mars book.
All right.
So you take the first one and I'll take the second one.
Okay. The Martian government was directed by 10 men, the leader of whom was selected by universal suffrage for 5 years and entitled Elon. 2 houses of parliament enacted the laws to be administered by the Elon and his cabinet.
Werner von Braun, Project Mars. It's undeniable. So, is it a happenstance? Of course it could be. But then again, think about the level that we're talking on with these people. And also there's the strange psychic thing and the story that hangs out there in history about Targ saying, well, von Braun's mother was like this well-known psychic in Germany. I think we're in unusual territory immediately. And I think that also gets us into something about the mystical aspect around SpaceX and extegonography, which, after all, that's what we're here for. This is the extegonography series.
Well, so leading in, what is the secret ripple technology that was developed over 60 years ago, and why is it still classified today, like many other things?
Well, this is fascinating because this gets us back into Berkner again. When I was looking at the final speech of Lloyd Berkner with President Kennedy, I saw the ceremony aspect, and I got very into the details about the ceremony. Here's what was going to happen when President Kennedy landed at the Trade Mart. He was going to be greeted by Air Force One helicopter coming and taking a flag that had been flown over the White House, and it was going to be handed to President Kennedy, who was going to hand it to Berkner, and they were going to have a military command around them. So this is going to be a very special announcement as well, because he's handing over the flag of the White House to Berkner. So they're saying something international and of major importance is going on here. I've maintained the assassination of President Kennedy was related directly to his aerospace policy and his NASA policy. And when you get into those players in that aspect, you find Berkner sitting right in the middle of it, because it was Berkner who was encouraging him to go to the moon. And actually, in his favorite speech, we chose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. That's Berkner. It's Berkner wrote it and gave it to him and said, this is what you should say about it to get people on the same level. So Berkner, who'd been in Antarctica, Berkner, who'd been in charge of the UFO file on record through the Robertson panel in the 50s, he's instructing Kennedy about the space program and how we should proceed. Kennedy, in the background, is making major moves to share the information around advanced aerospace and the UFO file with the Soviet Union. A number of documents came out relating to this. And he wanted to do a joint moon mission, and he wanted to do a shared space program. So that gets rid of the space race, that gets rid of the Cold War and all the rest of it. So these people in the background looking at this in the State Department, in the ex-protect type groups that deal with secrecy around advanced technology, they're looking at Kennedy horrified because he wants to share this. Also, I think the paperclip aspect comes in here because you have Nazis who've been recruited into our technological program, and they just fought a war with the Russians where they killed 25 million Russians on a low estimate. And here is Kennedy saying, here's all the advanced stuff. I'm going to share it with our counterparts. And it's very interesting. If you look at the memo, Kennedy says, I'm going to do this so that we don't have nuclear incidents related to UFOs. So if a UFO goes over, let's say, a major nuclear base, they won't think it's an attack by the United States on Russia. So he has a very interesting, sound reason for doing this. But he is thinking we need to get together on this, and we need, as far as space goes, to do it as a joint moon mission. Now, Sergei Khrushchev, who is Khrushchev's son, confirmed on the record that he and that Khrushchev and Kennedy were getting together to do this. So Kennedy's in the middle of this program. Well, he finds out that there's a secondary program being developed in NASA, which I refer to as the Secret Space Program, SSP. And there's a lot of information about the SSP out there now. And not all of it is good. But what I can tell you for certain is the roots of it and how we can track it are through things that happened in the Kennedy-NASA era. Because he said immediately, you can't have a public space program and a private one. It's one program. So he actually goes to NASA and says, I will give this program to the military if you don't make it a public program. I don't know what you're doing splitting the program. The name of the program is Blue Gemini, and this blue is the secret space program that you and I revealed last year. Now, the government came out officially, this is on record, and said last March, oh, yeah, we have the blue space program. We don't think there was anything really dramatic about the blue space program, but it was a secret program that we had, and we're announcing it here. You know, that's in direct response to us putting that out on the record because obviously questions got asked in those circles. So Berkner in 1963 at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he's the person President Kennedy is going to meet. And although Kennedy's records, you know, and the speech were scrubbed, Berkner's notes have been unearthed. And what he said was the speech that they were going to give, one, was going to have international implications that were staggering. Now think about, you know, Berkner and Kennedy going to meet him and all the things that Kennedy was doing with space. My suggestion is that it was going to be related either to a joint moon mission with the Russians or related to the UFO file. You can get real UFO file disclosure, which the government has had at least 80 years, probably a lot longer. But there's also false disclosure, which accompanies a UFO threat narrative. That's the thing that's being pushed out there for congressional hearings. The Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the NRO, those secret groups have their own narrative. And what they want to do is create a UFO defense office in order to generate billions of dollars to fight an imaginary threat. Now, the UFO file's real, but the threat isn't. This is the nature of the problem. So they love the threat part, but they will never tell you the real story. You'll never get genuine UFO disclosure from the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, the last thing was your question on Ripple technology. Now, Berkner is involved here again due to his role as an overseer at Brookhaven National Laboratory. So there were a series of nuclear tests that the US did in 1962 for Operation Dominic. Now, the test involving Ripple was almost perfectly clean, no fallout. So this was the Ripple technology, which is still classified, by the way, developed by scientist John Knuckles. And it represented an entirely new order of nuclear technology, no fallout. Now this would have decreased nuclear tensions with the Russians and gets into the secret X-Tech corridor. So there's some indication that along with the joint moon mission and the UFO file sharing aspect, an announcement on Ripple could have been part of this. The significance of the White House flag in the ceremony tells us a great deal about the JFK Berkner speech at the Dallas Trade Mart on November 22nd, 1963. Unfortunately, it never happened.
So, what is the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., and why do you refer to it as the UFO Bilderberg Group?
This is fascinating. Cosmos Club sits in Washington, D.C. It's been established since 1870. And all of the major players who've dealt with the UFO file secrecy have all been a major part of the Cosmos Club. Now, Bilderberg and Davos and these times of meetings of these major corporate heads getting together represent a kind of secret piece. Bilderberg, for years, they got together and the media wouldn't cover it. And they would have all these incredible meetings, like the top heads of state, and they would, it was very often suggested that they selected the next president, etc. And the Bilderberg group had been around since the 1952. So I was like, it made me wonder when these people were getting together away from the media and developing things like, prepping narratives, for example, social engineering and things of this nature. I said, where do they get together and discuss how they're going to play the UFO file to the public? Because as we've discussed, they've been developing a kind of breakaway technology. And at a certain point, that group that develops the technology, well, what do they have to do? They have to break back in with the advances. And then how do you explain it? So they're working out how to do that explanation. And I kept thinking, I wonder where over the years they've been meeting. So when I found a lot of the people involved, like J. Allen Hynek, major astronomers from the past, Carl Sagan, all these incredible people, over and over again, Donald Menzel, they were showing up in the Cosmos Club. And I looked into President Kennedy being involved, and he was a part of the Cosmos Club, but he resigned, which I thought was interesting. It made me think, he's resigning over the secrecy aspect again. And here we get to the core over and over again with Kennedy. He was not into the secrecy. He did a whole major speech about how the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. So they had a big problem with him going in. But the Cosmos Club, the founder, when I went into John Wesley Powell, I started to wonder, well, how about the founder? This goes back to 1870. Is there anything airship stuff related back there? And all of the major airship activity of the late 19th century that spurred, kind of the earliest UFO reports of all time, all were based around people related to the Cosmos Club, very interestingly. So the Cosmos Club represents one of those institutions that's still there that has a major role in relating to the early part of the UFO file. And it's fascinating because there's a character named Tillman who was involved with developing airships in the 1890s. And at a certain point during this whole wave of sightings, and there's massive reports, you can go back and check the reports, and it looks like these huge UFO waves over places like Texas, California, Ohio. Well, in 1897, one of these ships lands, and people are like, this is fascinating, what is it? And they go up to it, and a guy in a business suit comes out. I kid you not. And he says, this is our new airship. This is way before, this is like a decade before the Wright brothers. And he's flying this thing, totally more advanced than the Wright brothers plane. And he lands and he says, my name is S.E. Tillman. Well, S.E. Tillman was one of the high-ranking members of the Cosmos Club. And what you have, this institutionalized aerospace piece goes back. It goes back before NASA. It goes back before the rocket craze. There was already an established group back there. And that's why the Cosmos Club is kind of a key in all this.
That's so interesting.
Tillman, we could do a show on Tillman at a certain point, but whoa, what a player.
So how is Delshaw and NIMSA involved in early aerospace?
This is probably the most fascinating branch of research. And to put it this way, there was an advanced group back in 1850 that was already working with flight, long before the Wright brothers. So there's a figure named Charles Delshaw, who's an artist, actually, came over here at the age of 18 in 1850. And he was an agent for a private aerospace group in Germany called NIMSA. And I'll give you that, it's NYMZA. There's some in-depth work by an author named Walter Bosley on this. But But what I'll say about it is fascinating is this, is that Delshow himself went deep into the entire situation. And what he did was he talked at length about what was going on with the NIMSA group. So what happens is NIMSA is sending him over as an agent to this group called the Sonora Aero Club, who are in California. And the Sonora Aero Club were advanced scientists of the period putting together lighter-than-air machines, early airship pieces. This culminates later in the whole 1890s airship wave. But what he does is, at a certain point, he starts to notice tension between the Sonora Aero Club and the group in Germany called NIMSA. And NIMSA suggests a weaponry use for the aerospace arrows that are being developed by the Sonora group. And the Sonora group are flight enthusiasts, and they're saying, we don't want anything to do with that. But they're operating already with advanced technologies that make what we've developed later into flight, the Wright brothers piece, World War I airplanes. This stuff was already far more advanced beyond that. So what's fascinating is Delshow disappeared from history in 1920. Then all of his artworks showed up in an antique store. Somebody had come across this stuff. And in 1971, an author realized the significance of the whole thing. And he started to bring out the images of the airships that were being developed in the 1850s. Now, here's where it all dovetails with the JFK assassination. It's quite interesting. There's a character named John de Menil, and his wife's name was Dominique Schlumberger. And what happened was she was a major artist and a major kind of humanitarian of the period and philanthropist. So she put the Delshow art on display with all the arrows and all the rest of it. Well, in the Garrison investigation, he went into Schlumberger, or Schlumberger is the actual name in France is. They were the biggest oil company, operating 75% of the oil equipment in the world. And he found out over and over again that they were related to characters like George de Mohrenschildt, the oil geologist who shuttled Lee Harvey Oswald around. And it seemed kind of unusual. Here's Oswald making $1.25 an hour, and de Mohrenschildt is a millionaire. What does he want to do with this guy? Well, it's quite interesting because de Mohrenschildt is an oil geologist and later turns up writing letters to George Bush, who's the head of the CIA of the period, saying, this Kennedy assassination thing happened. I talked out of turn about Oswald. Not all these people are after me. I wonder if you can get me off the hook. And he sends a series of letters to George Bush that are on the record from the 70s. This is like 10 years after the Kennedy assassination. So de Mohrenschildt gets a subpoena, and they say, we're the House Assassination Committee. We think you have information about Oswald being connected to the CIA. He gets the subpoena, goes into his room, supposedly, and blows his brains out. Now, there's a lot of weird things about de Mohrenschildt, including the fact that he was obviously assassinated himself because they had finally figured him out. But here's the strange part. The Delshow images came through Jean de Menil and his wife, who were these incredible art connoisseurs. Those are the same people who had set up and were connected with de Mohrenschildt. So the Schlumberger Oil Company and de Mohrenschildt in Houston were, operated on a very elite level, and they worked with people like the Bushes, etc. This is why he wrote letters to Bush as CIA director later. So you're looking at a dramatic crisscross, but in the middle of it, it can't be denied that de Menil is the same person who put Delshow back on the map. Here's the Aero group again, back from the 1850s, NIMSA and the whole thing. And here's the thing. This is an Aero painting by Delshow, and it has two very interesting elements that are predictive. Remember earlier we looked at the Elon element that was predictive about von Braun's work. Mm-hmm. Well, when you look at this, what stands out for you is the name on the top. It says Trump.
Hard not to see.
On the bottom, on the right, it says 45, which is the art series. And Trump was the 45th president of the United States. Trump, 45, Aero airship, all in one snap. That's Delshau's painting.
Is that real?
It's real. It's in a museum right now in New York. It's been on display for 50 years, since the 1970s. Delshau has a series of works. He has over 500 paintings documenting the Sonora Aero Club. Apparently, Trump was on his radar 100 years earlier. Figure that one out.
I'm trying to.
So you can see we've come to a pretty deep place in the middle of all this. That's what happens when we get into the aerospace Aero aspect of this. It shows up, the crisscross, politically, geopolitically, over and over again. Advanced technology, aerospace, and the political side. That is dark journalism.
Well, so when you discuss the groups controlling the UFO file and refer to them as X-Protect and X-Share, which we've talked about before,
Yeah.
what is the difference and how can we know who is who?
Yeah, this is very important. X-Protect is a group that will protect the secrecy around the UFO file and the advanced technology and its implications at any cost. So they'll destroy reputations, they'll change news stories, they'll change fortunes for people, and at the final step, they will create lethal consequences for people who challenge their program. The X-Share people, as I've called them throughout history, President Kennedy is certainly, wanting to share the UFO file with the Russians than with the public. He represents a kind of X-Share personality. The way that you can basically spot them out through time is quite fascinating, because people like Thomas Townsend Brown, who's a major kind of black ops scientist, worked on some of the most amazing black projects for the United States government having to do with anti-gravity and things of this nature. This guy is a major X-Share character, and he created NICAP, which is the first major UFO organization. He wanted to share the information with the public. Well, I got a chance to talk to his daughter and find out the level of secrecy and pressure that he was under. And one of the things she told me was that when they would ask him to do certain things with the technology, weaponize it, as it were, when he would refuse, he would be threatened, and he would take the whole family to a little island in the Bahamas called Eleuthera. And they'd be hanging out there surrounded by machine gun security until the X-Protect wave passed. And this is the nature of what goes on in those programs. If you're a scientist in a program like that, and you have an X-Share quality to you, then it puts you under a very difficult situation, because the people who are running the programs are all about secrecy, and especially when it comes to the American public.
Well, the fact that they're just willing to sacrifice, lives in a way, like the daughter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's quite interesting because she had some interesting stories for me where she was working on a program with him, and she said, it was called the acoustic fan, and that it had all these amazing advanced properties, and she demonstrated it with him. And they went to the RAND Corporation, which is a major secret defense contractor, and major generals and people like Joint Chiefs, Curtis LeMay, and all these people came to this demonstration that he gave. And then the next day, he came to her and said, "You're going to Europe. And forget about the demonstration last night. Never talk about it again. And I want you to just forget all about this." And as a matter of fact, T.T. Brown himself kind of went off the radar shortly after that. She went to Europe and eventually got married, and all these things happened in her life. But when she was younger, she was his assistant. Well, after demonstrating that anti-grav technology for the RAND Corporation, that was the end.
That won't do.
Yeah. There can't be any sharing of that. And this is what gets us into the UFO file secrecy. That secret We mentioned physicist Robert Sarbarker earlier. He said it's the highest secret in the national security state, higher than nuclear atomic energy. It's the top. And the reason for that, apparently, is this Apotheum effect that we've discussed. So we'll get into that some more. But that is something that they feel like they can't control. And so the secrecy level becomes that thick. And I think we're in a period of time where people sharing ideas, on the internet, social media, where you can't, that type of secrecy won't work in a society like this. So they're prepping a narrative for how to explain that we've kept all this stuff under wraps for 80 years. And so far, it ain't flying.
No. How did we get here? Well, so why was President Kennedy assassinated over the UFO file?
This is really the crux of this, because again, the Berkner meeting, the final speech, the level of the ceremony around that speech grabs me, because flying in the flag from the White House tells me that his announcement was very likely related to space. Maybe it was the joint moon mission with the Russians. Whatever it was something that completely went off the charts, and he was assassinated before he got there. But on November 12th, if you go back into the history of President Kennedy, you will see that he asked the Central Intelligence Agency for all the, quote, high threat cases related to the UFO file. And that he said he wanted to share them because they were doing a joint program with the Russians. So therefore, for me, the direct correlation between the secrecy that they've been developing in the background and creating in places like Antarctica, which are so remote. We hear about Area 51 or whatever, right? But Antarctica is really, something goes down there, we won't know anything about it. And I think President Kennedy thought the public can handle this and there's a way to open up the public to it. But his first kind of lethal mistake in all of this thinking was that the groups in the background, he really thought he was the president. I guess this is the problem. And the groups in the background who were so dedicated to the secrecy aspect operated in that intelligence corridor between intelligence and aerospace. And it's very interesting because the only person who brought a prosecution in the assassination of President Kennedy was Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison, who was the New Orleans DA who went deep into the case, his final conclusion was that it's actually an aerospace intelligence wing of the military-industrial complex that did it. Well, that got lost in the mix somewhere along the line. I have a very interesting story about this, which is, I did a documentary a few years ago called Agent Oswald, and it was all about his CIA role. And a guy got in touch with me who was a Watergate lawyer. His name is Douglas Caddy, and he represented the Watergate 7. He's a historical figure. He's in his 80s now. And he contacted me and he said, there's so many things in your documentary that were right on. He said, but I want to tell you this, that my friend was E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt was the top CIA asset in the country. And I asked him before he went to prison over Watergate for breaking in at Watergate, what happened with President Kennedy's assassination. And then he stopped and said President Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to give our most vital secret to the Russians. He was going to share it. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And Hunt said it was the UFO file. That's a conversation that took place in private in 1975. And for me, it's more of that opening. And it's funny because recently I was contacted by somebody who worked in Kennedy's White House, and his bona fides are undeniable. He was a national security advisor, and he gave President Kennedy briefings on various matters. This guy, who came through a cancer scare, and he's a well-known figure, and he's just about 90 years old now, he went publicly and said, Richard Bissell, inside the Kennedy government, briefed me on otherworldly technologies. So that's a real dam about to break there. And we've had contact, as I mentioned to you. So this is opening up, and it is a 60-year-old secret that's going to blow wide open. So the question is, are we going to have the real truth about it, or are we going to have a huge narrative come out of the intelligence community? This is the battle going on in the background.
Well thought out fabrication.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, the narratives are very slick.
Let's get into some key figures controlling the UFO file and who were also involved in the JFK assassination, like Richard Bissell, Guy Bannister, and George Joannidis.
Well, it's quite fascinating, and we'll take the last one first. All those figures are very interesting, and they're all deeply connected to the UFO file, but they're very deeply connected to the cover-up of the JFK assassination. So Joannidis no one even knew that he existed. He was found by a Washington Post reporter named Jefferson Morley, who submitted the story to the Post, and they didn't want it. They said, oh, we don't want to get into this. But he had done all of this research about who was paying for things that were going on just before the assassination. For example, how did a full-page ad of Oswald show up in a newspaper immediately after the assassination saying, Fidel Castro sent it? He wanted to know things like that. And so he tracked back, and he found this character, Joannidis. And it's quite interesting because the confirmations that he got led him to sue the Central Intelligence Agency, who said, yes, he was our agent. Yes, he was our top psychological warfare operator. But no, you can't have any other information about him. So this guy controlled the Oswald project. He created a gigantic psychological warfare operation about Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald is a communist. Oswald is an agitator from Russia. Oswald is Fidel Castro's best friend, and he killed President Kennedy. Therefore, war against Russia or Cuba is on the table. This was his job, as it were. Interestingly enough, if you look into his history, later, there were going to be all of these hearings about the Kennedy assassination, even decades later, even into the 1990s. But in 1979 was the most crucial one. It was the test. It was the House Assassinations Committee. And the House Assassinations Committee demanded of Congress, give us the person who can give us all the information on the inside and vet it, etc. And it can't be anyone who was operational during the Kennedy assassination. And they said, no problem, George Joannidis. This guy will do it for you. What they didn't tell the people who were heading up that committee is that Joannidis created the Oswald project. He was the psychological warfare officer who created the entire situation. So he was operational in New Orleans as Oswald was operational in New Orleans the summer before the assassination. And he was running a group called the DRE. And that was a revolutionary group. And the whole idea was they were anti-Castro, and Oswald was pro-Castro. Now, here's the mix and the historical problem with the whole thing. Going into the history of Lee Harvey Oswald, he worked for Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was the most right-wing FBI lunatic you can imagine. He was to the right of Attila the Hun. How was Lee Harvey Oswald working for Guy Bannister? Well, if you go into Bannister's history, you're going to find that Bannister controlled the UFO file, and he came up with the nomenclature X. He's the one who said, this is Security Matter X, it's an X file. That's where that whole thing comes from. So Guy Bannister, it's very interesting that he had Oswald in his employ. Well, Oswald, he was working at a coffee company, Riley Coffee Company, and he was telling all the other employees there, I'm going to work at NASA. This is just before the assassination. And I've got this great job at NASA set up for me. So Guy Bannister, the UFO file, Oswald, NASA. The other name on that list is Richard Bissell. Well, Bissell is the person that got fired along with Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961. And the reason Kennedy fired them is unprecedented to fire a CIA director, especially Dulles, who was kind of the grand leader of the CIA for so many years. And Kennedy's conversation with Dulles went like this. He said, if this were the UK, I would have to go. But because this is the USA, you have to go. And Dulles was fired along with Bissell and his deputy director and this whole group of CIA people because they had tried to basically trick Kennedy into going to war with Cuba. So he got rid of them, but apparently Dulles remained the de facto leader of the CIA, even though Kennedy had fired him. And his lieutenant was Bissell. What did Bissell do in the 1950s? What was his program? By the time he got into the Kennedy administration in the 60s, he was in charge of Project Blue Book. He was in charge of all the secret UFO programs that we had. So Bissell shows up as this character that they called the mayor of Area 51. And he is somebody directly related to this piece around the assassination of JFK. So whenever you get into this and get into these figures, you're finding them associated with satellites, and you're finding them associated with Antarctica, you're finding them associated with the UFO file and the advanced technology that's wrapped in it. So it's very interesting when I was mentioning the various things that the physicist Berkner had done. He was the one to announce that Sputnik had happened. So it's the first satellite. This guy showed up in history all over the place. But when you look at these figures who are closely around the JFK assassination and you see the undeniable thread of them being associated with the secrecy of the UFO file, you have to conclude the aerospace groups were deeply involved in the assassination. There's no way around it.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll hold off. Well, so you've described the Apotheum effect as the biggest secret inside the UFO file. Can you describe what it is and why the deep state factions in the government are so loath to have it disclosed?
This is it. Like Apotheum, and this is the name I've given to it.
Yes.
But I've heard the effects and how they're described. One of the things that happened to me very early on is I knew Professor John Mack, but I knew his assistant, and his assistant introduced me to Mack on several occasions. Mack was the Harvard psychologist, and he put everything into the idea that aliens are real, UFO files real, and he was really lambasted for it in the era, if you look back on the stories, and they try to get him out of Harvard and all the rest of it. But Mack was a very interesting guy, and what he told me, basically, was that fundamentally it's an undeniable experience for the people who came into him from all walks of life, that they had had these different experiences. So Mack, kind of got me into thinking about this, the various effects that take place in a UFO happening. Time stops, people miss time. They're elevated through things. When they're abducted, they go through things. So these are all non-conformist to any known physics that we've ever heard anything about. People disappear. There's other things about the UFO appearance that I think is interesting. For example, when they show up and they land in a field, nothing will ever grow there again. So the nature of the effect of the UFO file, whether someone thinks it's an otherworldly, off-world group coming here to visit, or if it's a group here developing technology, there's an effect inside of the technology that creates this Apotheum, and it's a reality distortion effect. So that changes the relationship to time. And over again, you find people saying, well, I was going down the highway and 8 hours later, I found myself in a different location or whatever. So you're able to change the nature of reality. So I've come to the conclusion after reading how they try to redevelop it and kind of getting into a lot of the ex-share scientists, that it seems to me that their ability to aim this technology is not foolproof. That is, there's kind of a boomerang thing that's involved with it. And the only thing I can conclude is that, they say the torsion physics, there's this level of physics involved, is so great that it makes the atomic bomb seem like a firecracker. And so the level of secrecy that Sarbarka said, this is the top program, the UFO file, that's the top secrecy program. It's way beyond nuclear.
Yeah.
What does that tell you? So it puts us in a weird place getting into this. It tells us immediately that Apotheum is the thing that they're hiding. because I don't think just the idea of an off-world civilization visiting here is enough for the level of secrecy and the lethal secrecy that's often involved with this. For example, the assassination of a president. I don't think hiding the alien story is enough for that. I think it's something else.
Well, about nuclear.
Yeah, I know. Then what? Yeah.
Circling back to NASA, is NASA involved in the UFO file cover-up and the development of the secret space program? And what was the role of occult leader Aleister Crowley in its creation?
This is one of the most interesting things about NASA, and I think opens us up to the nature of it. Remember, I suggested that von Braun, with his mother who was psychic, there's a mystical element involved. If we don't get the mystical psychic part when it comes to the aerospace piece, there's a whole piece there, which is their spirits of the air, their understanding of space. Even in the drive of SpaceX and Musk, the language is very mythical. It's Arthurian. So when we get around Crowley, it's very interesting because, of course, he was the great beast himself, and he put out all these major black magic books. He led the OTO. He was the most sinister figure you can possibly imagine. How does he have anything to do with aerospace and rockets and being in the heavens and all the rest? Well, it turns out that the person who started off our rocket program was Jack Parsons. And Parsons had a very interesting relationship where he started the branch in California of the first OTO. And the OTO is Aleister Crowley's occult organization. And there's all this incredible setup of, this warm relationship between Parsons and our friend Crowley. Now, Crowley has something in a book called Moonchild, a ritual, and it's the Babylon Rising ritual, where you invoke these spirits and you basically bring in, it's kind of a Rosemary's Baby type thing. And Parsons was following along with Crowley, trying to do this with a very interesting companion, shall we say. So the ritual that they enacted took place in 1947 in the New Mexico desert. In the New Mexico desert in 1947, we get all the reports of the UFO file. Suddenly, everyone wants to talk about flying saucers and all the rest of it. There have been a number of people who've looked at the correlation of those dates and said, this is uncanny. Well, it's very interesting because Parsons, with all of his occult wisdom from Crowley, he became the foundational aspect of how NASA was created in the first place. And he dies in a strange explosion as well, somewhere along the line. It's just a fitting end for a cultist of that level. But I'll tell you, what's interesting to me about it is the influence that it had on NASA. And as a matter of fact, the JPL laboratory that they have is Jack Parsons' lab. That's JPL, which is, they changed the meaning of it to jet propulsion, but Jack Parsons has a crater on the moon named after him for all of his foundational work. He's the one. Well, if you go into Parsons' background, what was he doing in the 1920s and 30s, in addition to being so involved with Crowley and working on these rocket experiments, and really being an indispensable scientist in the middle of all this for Caltech? It's quite fascinating because what he was doing was having these intense long-distance calls back then with Wernher von Braun in Germany. And in Germany, von Braun is back there, and he is, mystified by this whole process about how we can get into space. And he has all these mystical elements on his side, too. So we have a combination there of these figures, and it's a very, very deep occult tie that ties in Crowley and Parsons. But the person who comes out of that whole thing is not who you would expect, or maybe you would, but it's L. Ron Hubbard, who starts Scientology. He is close friends and a disciple of Parsons. And he's a prolific sci-fi writer. And after a while, he realizes, I'll turn Scientology into it. Well, Scientology has a heavy space ET component to it. When you get up to these higher and higher levels, you get information about space beings and things of this nature. Well, that all comes out of Parsons and Crowley. So you can see this wave from NASA, from Crowley, through Scientology. We're right in the middle of this gigantic mystery of how do all these things connect after all?
I have so many questions about that. Okay. Well, so...
That one, there's no question Crowley is the weirdest part of it.
Yeah, he just he took both and ran on out. Well, okay. So, do you think the latest UFO hearings with proposed intel whistleblowers in Congress will have any bearing on getting to the truth about the secret UAP programs?
No. I mean, you could say as a society it's always good. And it probably does me some good from the level of research that I do that more people start to hear about the topic. But the hearings in general, the UFO Congress, the congressional hearings dealing with this, all the witnesses that they have come forward, they're like, hey, he's a whistleblower, he's a whistleblower. When I go into their backgrounds just a little bit, they come directly out of the CIA. They never left it. They're not whistleblowers. And they keep alluding to secret programs, and I'll tell you more. I'm going to give you the secrets, and UFO this and UFO that. They've changed the name of it to UAP, as we know. That's also part of their marketing campaign. So one of them is a character named Lou Elizondo. And Elizondo is a CIA counterintelligence agent. It's very simple. So he was part of Tom DeLonge's TTSA, and a radio station actually set up a debate podcast between myself and Tom DeLonge from, Blink-182. This guy was a rock star guy doing his UFO group. Well, they used somehow, when this came out in 2017, they were using Tom DeLonge to promote this idea of the UFO thing to the teen crowd or the younger set. But all the people around it were all, as I investigated his group, they were all CIA people and like really high ranking, directorate, top of the line, and intense experience. But without a doubt, they all were straight up CIA people. So I instantly said, and did a number of reports on it, and they got a lot of pushback, and they changed it around, and they pushed this guy Elizondo out. And then he lied to the public repeatedly about the various things that he was involved in. He said, I led a secret UFO program, and then I resigned because they wouldn't give the truth to the public. Well, he never resigned, and he never led the program. So those things are on the record now. And now when he goes out and he talks about it, because he has a new book that he's touting called Imminent about UFO disclosure, he says, well, I didn't lead the program, but I was a part of it. So, little
Who said I resigned?
Yeah.
Who said that?
So you have to take them. What they have is they're prepping the narrative, and the narrative on their side is we have a UFO threat, and we need a UFO defense office and the intelligence agencies to fight it, and you have to trust us, And by the way, that whole origin story of humanity, we're going to give you the real thing on that. Hey, you're going to get to nirvana with the CIA giving you the talking points of your own history. I mean, the CIA, inveterate liars. I mean, the worst liars. And they've stonewalled the public. So this rebranding is quite something. So that's what you get in the congressional hearings. I've talked to some of the people involved in setting up the hearings. And I will tell you that they don't know much about the topic. And that's the sad part about it. They
Not
just
the
like
UAP. Oh no!
Here it comes.
If the Breakaway civilization or expert tech group have been working for 80 years, a long time, on programs or re-engineering the X technology in the UFO File, what kind of technology do they have that we in the public don't know about?
That is the absolute question. This is the crux of the matter. So we'll take 80 years at least. All right, that brings us back to the 40s. It goes even further back, but in that period of time, they've been able to work on advanced technology completely outside of oversight from the public. Although the public has funded what they've done. So these are the black budget programs And their excuse all along the way is, well, it's national security, it's got a secrecy level, there's no oversight. When we get into a situation like this, the problem is those people become a tighter and tighter and tighter group. So that's where the X-Protect secrecy comes from, that's where the breakaway aspect comes from, because they start to say, oh, we have all these advances, why do we need to share that with the public? And that was the original problem. And it came about through the National Security Act in 1947, which basically established the Central Intelligence Agency, and it said, you aren't responsible for illegal activity. So there's a charter inside the CIA which gives them carte blanche to do things that aren't legal. This is the nature of part of the problem that we face as a country, that the National Security Act set up these intelligence groups. And it's funny because if you go back and you read Truman's comments about it, it's very interesting because he said, well, I got dragged along into doing this, but I didn't want to create an American Gestapo. And that's what they became. So by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, he says, I want to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. So they're aware of an enemy there. The problem is that in the Central Intelligence Agency and inside of NASA, you have two big forces that are problematic. And both of them come from this aerospace paperclip aspect. So in that period of time, they said two things about Kennedy. He wants to share the UFO file, one. Two, he wants to be able to, smash the CIA. And sitting inside the CIA are the influence groups that came out of that post-Nazi era. So, Kennedy is on a mission to share the UFO file, and these groups are developing that secrecy in the background. In terms of what they have, this is very interesting because they've been talking about this Artemis program to go to the moon with. Well, we did our last manned moon mission in 1972. What have you been doing for 52 years? There's been nobody on the moon. We've had no manned space missions to Mars. It's funny because if you read the autobiography of Gordon Cooper as the Gemini astronaut who set up the Apollo flights, one of the earliest guys, the most clued in, he said, I was called in by Werner von Braun, and he said, you're going to lead the mission to Mars. You're it. Put it together. You're the commander. And he said, I got myself fit. I was working out this whole thing. He structured the Apollo missions. And he thought, well, I'm going to do this. And then at a certain point, someone came to him and said, don't talk about the Mars mission. Forget about it. Forget it was ever mentioned. That's it. And he was like, well, forget about this. I'm getting out of NASA. That's enough of that. And he ended up hearing in 1971 that in 1981, they were going to land on Mars, that they had the program set. And he said, well, what's going on here? And then it never happened. So there was a program there. Kennedy launched the program for NASA. They were supposed to go to the moon and then Mars. And then, basically create space infrastructure. The question is, what happened instead is that they created a secret space program with secret infrastructure. The public never got to see it, even though they funded it. That's why 50 years later, they can say, hey, we're going to the moon. That's why you have SpaceX, which is a privatized company after all. But all those things wouldn't have the infrastructure without the public being represented. The public funded NASA, which set this up in the background. But we never got a space program out of it. The privatized space program came up. So that's how they developed it, through a secret space program.
I'm so glad we funded that.
How do you get the money back? This could be a good question for the UFO hearings.
It is.
Give us the money back.
Ask it.
Where are the missing trillions?
Where are the monies? So, if X-Protect is the CIA aerospace group responsible for assassinations relating to the UFO file, what other figures, in addition to JFK, were eliminated for wanting to share the UFO file? Like, who else was at stake?
I'll tell you a key one. There's so many. I'm trying to think of who to choose. There's that many. Morris Jessup, I think, is one of the most important. Jessup is interesting because he's an astronomer, and he writes the case for the UFO. And he, in 1956 and 57, has kind of legitimized UFO research. And they are afraid of him being a scientific figure who's doing this. So he is very close friends with someone named J. Manson Valentine. And Manson Valentine will show up on the radar in a very important way in the 1960s, finding the Bimini Road. And he's associated with all this deep research off of Bimini, finding exotic technology, as we covered in our Hot Zone episode. Well, Manson Valentine's friend Jessup says, I have something very important to share with you. And I'm coming down to see you in Florida to do this. So, in a weird way, kind of like Admiral Byrd's son, he ends up missing.
Oh, I was just going to ask, did he make it?
So he shows up in a Florida park, and he's tied the hose. The carbon monoxide kills him in the car. So somewhere between driving down to see his friend, being all excited to do this, he ends up suicidal, apparently, and kills himself in his car. Jessup had it that not only was there a UFO question, but that there were already interactions going on between the governments and an off-world civilization. So he was already advanced on this side of things. But he also knew the technology edge, and I think that they regarded him as too much of a threat. There's a series of ex-protect situations that we get into where the people end up over and over again dead. There's just no way to get around that. And I think President Kennedy is kind of the most dramatic example.
Yeah.
But ex-protect, they work, they're not just a lethal assassination group, but they have assassination as a major tool in the middle of all that. And, when you hear in this election, people like RFK Jr., who his family has the background in the UFO file, President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and when you hear them saying, I want the JFK files released and I'm open to the UFO stuff, that sends shockwaves through those groups. There's no question about it.
Well, so what is the goal of Ex-Protect and the Breakaway civilization? Like, do they hope to become an elite space-faring ruling group and just leave humanity behind using the secret space program? Or what's kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Look, here's what they're trying to do. I'll boil it down. The original Nazi program around their space program was control of things on the ground from space. It's pretty close if you think about it. So all the things that on one hand can have really fantastic possibilities like Starlink and the satellites and all the rest of it. At the same time, they have the ability then to track everything. So every piece of that, when it gets into tighter and tighter totalitarian hands, there's nowhere to hide from it. This is a very old program. And again, the groups that developed it were deeply involved with aerospace. And their goal was, very simply, control of things on the ground from space. So space stations, low Earth orbit, satellites, all these different things that are being developed in space, and the infrastructure that's been developed in space under secret conditions that we don't have access to. And I bring up the story very often about Gary McKinnon, who is the NASA hacker, and his story is undeniable. He hacks into NASA, and he finds two things that are crucial. One, all kinds of information about the UFO file, and two, an off-world officers list. So there's an entire off-world officers division that exists, the public, that you and I don't know anything about. McKinnon, they wanted to prosecute him in the United States, and there's a famous occasion where Obama, at the time, goes and he's standing there with Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, and they ask him, they were like, what about Gary McKinnon? They're trying so hard to get him. What are you going to do to him? And he said, oh, you'll find out, you'll find out. We'll go through normal legal channels to get him, but we're going to get him. They don't, because there's something about him having Asperger's, and there's some medical loophole that allows him not to be prosecuted in America. If he were, it would have been a Julian Assange style situation. So, but the reason they wanted to prosecute him is simple. Yeah, he hacked into NASA for sure, but what did he reveal? The off-world officers list. Now, people will say, well, we would know about that if there were a program like that, for example. I always go to the National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO existed. It started in 1961. It was not revealed as a program until 1994. 33 years, operated billions of dollars every year. And basically what it did was it controlled satellite secrecy, reconnaissance. Nobody knew anything about it. So yes, what is the organization then that's operational now that is doing something related to the UFO file that we don't know anything about? We could wait 30 years.
When is it going to be 30 years for us?
Right. Is it going to be 30 years? That's the question.
Well, so if JFK made it to the Dallas Trade Mart to make his final speech with Lloyd Berkner on November 22nd, 1963, instead of being assassinated, what kind of world would we be living in now? What do you think?
Well, I think that Kennedy had a vision of freedom. And Kennedy also was coming from a place that the more open the society was, the more progressive it would be.
Transparency.
Transparency, exactly. But I think what happened along the way was he was too far ahead of his time. And it's interesting because Gorbachev, who gave a speech at the Texas School Book Depository, which when you think about it, is quite unusual, considering it's the spot from where Kennedy was assassinated. So I think he was sending a message there in that period of time, because Gorbachev has gone on the record about the UFO file extensively, including the fact that Reagan came to him and said in Reykjavik during one of their summits, you know, if we have to deal with the UFOs, like if there's a battle, will you help us? Gorbachev went on the record with this New York Press Club. I have the clip. And he gives the whole story, and then he says, you know, I'm sorry. Because the people in the room are stunned, and he realizes that he's dropped quite a bomb, but he's like, Reagan took it very seriously, and he said, you know, if there's a UFO battle of some kind, are you going to help us? We're going to be joined together, Russia and the US, to fight this thing. Over and over again, when you get into this, you're going to find there's all this pressure around presidents not to get together with their Russian counterparts. So JFK and Khrushchev, he said, send all the State Department people away. I just want me and the translator and Khrushchev. They were upset at that. Reagan did the same thing. Gorbachev, I just want the translator. Putin and Trump did the same thing. I just want the translator. There was all this freaking out. You know, Trump is a Trump puppet. You know, he's a Putin puppet and all the rest of it. Whatever you think of that, it's part of that pattern, again, of them not wanting the president level to get together with the Russian side. Because in my opinion, the same groups that control the level of that technology do not want these leaders discussing the UFO file together on that senior level. So if President Kennedy had made it to the Trade Mart, we would have had the space part on a totally different level, and we would be living in a totally different society. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The UFO file, it was early to reveal the UFO file, but if he was revealing it and giving briefings and having all that happening in the background then you would have seen some kind of disclosure in the 1960s. Think of us now. Now it's 2024, here we are at the end, you know, right in the middle here of this decade, and we're looking at a situation where all we're getting is the CIA disclosure and, you know, the congressional intelligence community version of this thing. It's 60 years later. So I think this is the nature of the problem. And as these pieces open up about Antarctica, about paperclip, about advanced technology, and about managing these narratives, I think people will come to their own conclusion that we're living inside of someone else's walls of secrecy. And inside of that wall of secrecy, we'll never get anywhere as a culture. That's still a hardcore control culture. So what you need to do is smash the secrecy. The way to smash the secrecy is to get past the narratives and even the false historical narratives. In this case, JFK was killed by a lone gunman who just happened to get a lucky shot off, a magic bullet, all that stuff. And what's interesting is Oswald himself, if you think about him and his background with Bannister, the UFO file, and NASA, he represents that aerospace link directly in the assassination. And I think that puts us where we are today.
We're entitled to the truth, but will we find it?
That's a real good question. Yeah. I think the pressure is on heavily to obfuscate. But I think there are ways around it. And like we've pointed out tonight, some of the people even from that era are coming out and saying, yes, I was associated with that program. And as long as we get the legitimate voices, we'll be in great shape.
Well, so, if the JFK assassination files that the CIA is blocking from the public after 61 years are finally released, let's hope, as RFK Jr. is attempting to accomplish, will Lloyd Berkner and the UFO files be in those secret records, do you think?
Yes, he's definitely in the records. And this is very interesting because when you have a figure like RFK Jr. looking for resolution around the JFK files, and you have presidential candidates pledging that they're going to open up the files as soon as they get into office, that sends shockwaves through that entire deep state operation. And so that's a big problem for them because on a family level, those people know. So if Robert Kennedy's son, you think about the knowledge level of Robert Kennedy working as the Attorney General of John F. Kennedy, he knows everything there is to know about the UFO file from that era. So I think that this is a major piece of it. If you get the JFK files open, the cascade effect that takes place after, especially relating to the UFO file, is dramatic. It is an avalanche. And so the question is, can they get it accomplished? Remember what Trump said to Napolitano. I couldn't release those records. You couldn't release those records. Well, can they be released?
And then what? Who
that's
else comes out? Who has other information to say?
Yes. I think that what we'll learn is that President Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. That's the problem.